Alright students, today we were talking about percents in class. And percents are comparing to 100, a ratio, or just a fraction of comparing to 100. The big thing that I want you to remember with percents is that the word per 100 is out of 100. Always remember it being out of 100. Cent is always out of 100. 100 pennies is a cent. Century, so on and so forth. So remember that, and it'll help make a little bit more sense here. Write each ratio as a percent. Well, remember, a ratio is just a comparison between two separate numbers. So in this case, I'm going to be comparing these numbers, and I want to find their percent. This ratio isn't necessarily written like a ratio, though. So to write that as a ratio, I'm going to write it as 26 over 100. In a recent census, 26 out of every 100 people living in Illinois were younger than 18. So 26 out of 100, since this is already over 100, how many parts per 100 is this? Well, it's 26. So this is pretty easy. It's 26%. So what is this 26%? Well, this 26% is the people living in Illinois who are younger than 18. That's how many people are younger than 18. And that would answer this first question. This other one said, what percent of people are older than 18? Well, if I pulled 100% of the people and 26% were younger than 18, well, the difference between these two will tell me the percent that was older. So I'm just going to subtract these, and I will end up with 74. 74% would then be older than 18, because 74% plus 26% would equal 100%, or the total amount of people who lived there. Next question. Again, write each ratio as a percent. At a local middle school, 140 students take Spanish for every 100 students who take French. What percent of the students take French? So here we go. Watch this carefully. What percent of the students take French? Well, how many total students are there that we're talking about? We're talking about 140 who take Spanish, 100 who take French, and assuming those are the only two languages they have, there's a total of 240 students. If 140 take Spanish, for every 100 who take French, what percent of the students take French? So I know that 100 out of the 240 take French. And then I want to figure out what percent that is. So to figure out the percent, we are just going to divide. We'll take our calculators. Well, there's mine. Take our calculators and divide them. 100 divided by 240 is about 41.6%. And so we'll probably end up rounding that to 42%. Would take French. And then all we had to do is divide, because remember, how do I take a fraction and turn it into a decimal? I divide those two numbers. Alright, same thing over and over again. During his football career, Dan Marino completed a pass about 59 times out of every 100 passes he threw. What is his percent for completed passes? Always look at these words. This is where questions will try and trick you. I want to know my percent for completed. The number they gave me up here was for completed, so this is good. I know that there were 59 completed out of every 100 that he threw. And again, this is already over 100, so it's super easy because I already have it in my parts per 100. It would be 59%. let's say you're not sure when this works and when it doesn't work. Try typing it in your calculator. 59 divided by 100, right there, gives you 59%. Write each fraction or proportion as a ratio as a percent. So, about 1 out of every 10 Native Americans in the U.S. are part of the Cherokee Nation. What percent is this? So I have 1 out of 10. Remember our ratios. This isn't already out of 100. So what do I do with this? This one I have multiple options for. One, I could just look at this and say, hey, I know that's 1/10. 1/10 would be written like that. And then to find its percent, I want to figure out of how many out of 100. So if I'm going to take this one and multiply it by 10, I'm going to take this and multiply it by 10. That would give me 10 over 100, which over here would make me multiply this by 10. And 1/10 times 10 is going to be 10, so we're going to end up with 10%. I could just divide these again as well, but this one is pretty easy to make it equal 100. Let me set it up this way. If I had 1/10 and I wanted to know how many parts out of 100, all of a sudden this looks like a proportion that we just did in chapter 4. 10x on this side, 100 on this side, and then set up my railroad tracks. What am I solving for? X, what's bothering it? The 10. How? They're multiplying. Inverse, divide. When I divide those, I find out yet again my answer is 10. So I can set it up as the proportion and solve it that way. Again, let's write it as a percent. About 1 out of 200, about 1/200th of the toys were defective. So for every 200 toys that they make, one ends up being defective. What percent of the toys are defective? Well, we can again do this in two ways. 1 over 200 equals how many over 100, because I want to compare this to 100. Well, in this case, I divided it by 2, and I can divide this by 2, so this would be 0.5. 0.5%. That's not 5%, it is 0.5% in this case. You just have to be careful with that. How many of the toys are not defective then? So not defective would be, if 1 out of 200 are, 199 are not defective. And what percent would that be? Because I always want it over 100. Can do my cross multiplying, and I'll end up with the opposite of this. Well, not the opposite, but the complement, I suppose, or the sum to equal 100, which would be 99.5% of the toys would end up being not defective. Again, you could finish your fish method here to solve that. Another thing I could have done here would just again been to have divided. There it is, 1 divided by 200. And if I have to move my decimal twice, once 2, it would have been 0.5. So 0.5 would have been the answer again. All right, here's another one. Almost 3 out of 4 people, 3/4 of people who travel buy tickets online. What percent of people buy their tickets at the counter? So watch carefully. This is one of those questions that's trying to get you. 3/4 buy online. That's what the data tells us. The question wants to know who buys them at the counter. If 3 out of 4 buy online, that leaves 1 out of every 4 to buy at the counter. Now we need to find the percent. This is a pretty easy one. You should know 1/4. Think about money, think about quarters. If not, again, divide or do your proportion. 1/4 equals what over 100? And in this case, I think it's fairly simple because I could just take this and multiply it by 25. Take this times 25. 4 times 25 is 100. 1 times 25 is 25. So 25% of their people buy their tickets at the counter. I have a few more examples here and I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to do all of these. Let's just set one up here that might be a little bit more difficult. Take this and write it as a percent. So I can again write it as 9 over 20. I can divide it and solve it. Or I can say, okay, how many times does this go into 100? As I look at this, 20 to get up to 100, I'm going to multiply it by 5. So I'll do the same here. And I'll have 45 over 100. You could set all of these up that same way or divide. Oh, well, it looks like we did have the opportunity for a few more examples. We'll finish solving these. 7 over 10. 7 over 10 equals how much over 100? How do I go from 10 to 100? I multiply by 10. 7 times 10 is 70 over 100. Remember that percents was per 100. How many parts? I should put the word here, parts per 100. There are 70 parts per 100, 70%. Last but not least, 1 over 500 equals how many over 100? Going this way is always tricky because, yeah, we can see that this would pretty easily just be divided by 5. But then you have to remember that this whole x then would be 1/5. And that's kind of tricky when we're dealing with decimals on top of fractions and trying to figure out how to do this. So let's just use our proportions that we learned again in chapter 4. Solve them with the railroad track problem. I'm solving for x, so I'm going to divide both sides by 100, or 500, I'm sorry. Those will go away. This will leave me 1/5, and if I was to convert that, I would find out that it would be 20%. Again, either do that by dividing or setting it equal to 100. 20%. And some of these you'll just get to know. They will just become stuck in your brain when we get to section 5.4 and we start talking about learning percents mentally. That'll just become one that you will memorize. All right, good luck with your homework.